here is I'm going to create a new library, new folder, make the directory. This is going to be Angular Forms Demo. And I'm going to go into it. Now, at this point, we know that there's some things that we need already. So I'm going to end up grabbing them. Right off the bat, we know that we're going to need Express. We're going to need Angular. We're going to need Angular UI Router. And we're going to need Bootstrap. Right? We've used these a bunch of times. You don't have to do this in one step, but for the sake of this demo and getting it done, let's grab these things early on. Let's do an npm init. So I've got my package JSON file there. And let's do an npm install, and we're going to grab Express. We're going to grab Angular. We're going to grab Angular UI Router. And we're going to grab Bootstrap. So all of these are going to be in our Node Modules folder, and we'll end up saving them. Again, you don't want to have any of these in your repository. I can always tell, by the way, when I end up doing when I grab your repos and I clone them, I can always tell the ones that have the Node modules in it because there's so much more stuff that's coming across the wire. Most of you are pretty good about it. And usually you have a global, one thing you can always look at when you start getting into Git a little bit more is to have a Git global file, so you'll never end up having that Node modules folder. So once we end up doing this, a couple of things I'm going to do. If I look at this, I'll have my Node modules folder. Let me just sort of get myself set up a little bit. I'm going to touch an app.js file and also a server.js file just to create them. So I've got those two files. I also know that I'm going to need a routes folder as well. Just as long as I'm here, let me end up creating it. Do I need one? Maybe not. Let's see. I am going to need a browser folder. So let me just create that. Okay. With that, I could start opening this up and looking at it and seeing about what we're going to do when we start this out. We'll keep this kind of simple without having a real sort of database here. So let's go over here into my package JSON file. I'm going to want to start this out. So we're going to do a start. And again, I'm going to do start dev, right? Because again, in my development environment, I'm going to start things off. In my development environment, I'm going to use NodeMon. And I'm going to say NodeMon. And in order to start this, we'll say server.js, or just server, I think will work. And with this, I could say npm run. By the way, npm run will show you all the npm commands that you could run. It's actually an interesting thing, right? Even if you didn't see this before, I think this is kind of cool. By default, there's actually an npm start, which will run node server. That's why when we end up pushing things up to Heroku, our app will start automatically, because this will end up running. This is why I don't want to create our own start, because this is what we want to run when we end up deploying. That's why I end up doing start dev here. And that's not a built-in command. That's why when we start it, we have to do npm run start dev. Okay, and we'll keep this fairly simple here. What I'm going to do is I'll start off with my Express app. We will say Express, and we'll say app equals Express, and we'll say module exports equals app. And all we want this to do at this point is to, I'm not even going to use Swig. We'll just render that index HTML page by saying send file. Again, the only thing that I'll note is that if there was data that you wanted to send back that was going to be somewhat dynamic, then you'd want to use Swig and send your partials. And again, Swig is going to be used for templating on the server, right? Where Angular has its own templating engine on the client, right? They look very similar. I think that's one of the nice parts about sort of knowing Swig. So here, what we're going to do is let's do an app.get, put a function here, request, response, next. And we'll go over here and we'll say response.send file. And we'll just do path.join because it needs an absolute path, DAR name, and here we'll just say index HTML, keep things simple. Okay? If we're going to use path, we'll bring this in and say path equals require path. That's already built into Node. Okay? Any lines I've written that people haven't seen before? Makes sense, right? Once we end up doing this, let's go into our server, and for our server, I'm going to say server require HTTP create server require app. So a server can be created. A server is going to need to know how to handle requests and responses. If we end up giving it an Express application, our server is going to be fine. Otherwise, we'd have to, write our own type of Express, which we don't want to do here. So now once we do that, let's just say port equals process environment port, which again in a production environment would be defined for us. And here we'll say 3000. And we'll say server dot listen on the port. Let's put a function here. And we'll say console.log listening on port plus port. So if we end up going back here, we should see that we're listening on this port. And if we went to browse to this, let's open up a browser. And we'll go over here and we'll say localhost 3000. And we'll say, see, there's no file called index.html. Let's go and create that by going back here. Index.html. And what's kind of interesting about this is that when we rerun this, we'll see that this is blank, right? And we could go in here and start building out our index.html. So here, we'll put our HTML here, put our body here, and my sort of a sanity check to see if Angular is working is to put something within some Angular syntax. And we don't see anything here, which means Angular is not loaded, which makes sense because we don't have Angular on the page. Plus, we've got to specify that we've got an Angular app by just putting in that ng app directive. Still nothing. But the second that we go in here and put a head in here, again, it's important to sort of know where the magic is coming from. And here, putting in a script tag, and our source is going to be, and we'll specify that this is going to be an angular.js, which in fact exists within our node modules under Angular. But we're going to have to do what? In order to serve that, we're going to have to set up a static route, which we can do right over here. App, use, express, static, path, join, directory name, node modules, 1, 2, 3. And that should be able to serve up our Angular.js file. And if we go back here, we should see that Angular is now set up. I guess my second step here would maybe be to say, all right, well, we're going to have a certain app running here. Let's call our app app forms. Of course, when we do this, if I opened up my console, it would tell me that I don't know what this app forms is here. So let's go in and set that up. And the way that we'll do that is we're going to have a script, and this is going to be our code. We don't want to put it in our node modules folder, but let's, within our browser folder, let's have an app.js. If I do this, I'll see that that app.js file can't be found, doesn't even exist. And I'm going to want to put that in my browser app.js. And what do I want to put within that? I'm going to say Angular. We know Angular exists because we were able to do ng-app. Angular module. And this is going to be app forms. App forms. And we're going to need this second parameter here. And if we're able to serve that, this should work. But of course, what do we need to set up in order to serve from that browser folder? Another static route. So for the sake of time, let's go in here. And this is not going to be node modules. This is going to be browser. That'll end up getting served. And we'll see that we're still in business here. Let's actually go in and just bring in our bootstrap so it looks a little bit nicer. So we'll say link, and this is going to be a style sheet. And this is going to be href, and this is going to be bootstrap, dist, CSS, bootstrap, CSS. And if we do that, we should see at least a different type of font. And let's go over here and start setting this up by putting in a little navigation. So I'm going to say div class is container, closing div, and let's put a UL. This is going to be class nav tabs, UL. We'll put a list item, and we're going to have two different tabs here. So let's have a home tab, a home. And just to use the stuff that we ended up doing on Tuesday, let's give this a UI sref of home. Oh, just waiting for the second. And so here we'll go over here and we'll do UI sref active. And this is going to be active. So if this, did a little bit of magic here, I have to admit, exactly how that works. I mean, I guess what's happening here, Angular is, I guess, smart enough to know that if there's a link within here, and that's your chosen link, that it knows to set that as active. A little bit of magic there for me. I would have to look at that directive and see what it's doing. My guess is that directive ends up looking and sees if there is a link that's active and sets that as being active. Little magic, I'll give you that. Here, we're going to have an sref of home. And let's do a second sref, because I want to show you nested states. And this is going to be an sref of tabs. Now, right now, this is going to totally get ignored for any number of reasons. One of the reasons why this is going to end up getting ignored is that, first of all, this does nothing. By the way, if I had a valid link here, and my states were understood, I would actually be able to see a URL. If I go and dig into this by selecting it, I'll see that there's no href here because I don't even have a state provider set up. So one of the things I'm going to do here, just to show you to separate things out a little bit, is that I'm going to create another file. I'm going to call this config.js. And I'm going to say Angular module app forms. Again, this time I'm accessing this. And I'm going to go over here and I'm going to say config. And this is going to be my function. And I'm going to grab my state provider and also my URL router provider. By the way, the URL router provider, this actually is built into Angular. It's actually a router provider for states, but it just is not as good as the state provider. Which, again, right now, if I run this, by the way, if I run this now, I'm not going to see an error. Why not? No errors. Okay, the reason why I don't see any errors is that I got to make sure that one of the things that I do here in my index file is bring in my config. I'll throw something out at you. There's something called, you could look it up, it's an NPM package. I think it's called JS inject or something like that. It's kind of a cool thing. You could sort of run a task. You could run it when you're, so in other words, when I do npm run start dev, you could actually put other things in there. One of the things you could do is say, hey, look, see that folder over there? I want to watch that folder. And if I add anything or I modify anything to that folder, I want you to automatically end up looking at my index.html file and inject those scripts here. And there's some syntax that you use, looks something like this, inject JS. I mean, this is not going to work because this is not set up. And inject, and I'm totally lying about this being the syntax, but you could actually specify and say, hey, look in that folder, and by the way, always load the app.js and the config app.js and then the config.js, and then anything else that's after that within those folders or subfolders, and it'll end up adding them. I'm just sort of throwing that out because you'll see eventually, you know, in a big enough application, you're going to lose your mind by saying, oh man, it's going to happen 50% of the time. You're going to forget to include the file here, and you're going to think something is broken.
We got stuck for like 40 minutes.
Yeah, it's totally it totally happens. Again, usually when it happens the fourth or fifth time, it's less. I shouldn't say 50% of the time, but surely like 10% of the time it will happen. When you're first developing, it's 50% of the time. So once I end up doing this, now I'll see some errors because it's not going to know what state provider is. So again, I ended up installing my UI router with npm. So now I could bring it in, and this is going to be Angular UI router, and this is going to be release Angular UI router.js, and I think it's release, but let's just do a quick check by going over here. And it is release, and here's Angular UI router, and that should make that error go away. Not yet. In the module itself. Oh yes, thank you. Another thing that could go wrong, right? You're going to want to put in UI router. By the way, there are all kinds of projects that you could use. All this sort of bootstrapping that we're doing to get up and running with both Express and with Angular, there's all kinds of tools that'll make your life easier. When you get really good at this and you feel really comfortable with it, you can start using those tools. And it basically is nothing more than there's an Express generator, you type Express, right, and you get a new Express application. Okay? And there are tools that'll actually bootstrap, you know, get your Angular stuff set up as well. But you know what? Not now. You know, once you start to get into senior phase, you're comfortable with this, then do it, because when you look at those generators, if you didn't go through all this stuff now, there'd be things going on there that you wouldn't understand. Now, if you do this a couple times, it's fine to use those generators. You know what it's like doing? Initially, we could have written out our own package JSON file. It's not that incredibly hard to do, but again, npm init ends up doing it for us. So for that, it's a little bit more complicated. You know, I would definitely say go for it. Now, once I do this, UI router, because it's not called UI router, it's called UI dot router. Okay, so now we're in business. Now let's set up some states. So we're going to set up some states in our config file. So here's our browser, okay? And what we're going to do with our state provider, we'll have two states. And we're going to have a state, and this state is going to be home. We're going to configure it with an object. And I know in the review, the idea of actually setting up multiple config blocks, I don't think it really ends up buying you that much. I think with a big application, you might not necessarily, these are basically your routes on the client side. So small enough application, one config file will do. Bigger application, you might break it up. It's totally fine. We're going to have two of these things. We're going to have tabs. And just to sort of see that this is working, two things that are sort of mandatory here. A URL of / And I'm just going to start out with a template that says home. This will just put the text home in a UI view. And for this one, I'm going to do a URL of tabs. And for a template, I'm going to specify tabs. And the only thing that's going to be, once I end up doing that, if I click on this, notice, it's kind of subtle here, but this didn't happen before. It shows me what my URL is on the bottom. It recognizes that. It puts in the href. And on tabs, it'll end up doing the same thing. And the only thing that I need to do here, actually, look, if I click on that, it will select it. If I click on this, it will select it. I want it to select home by default. And this is where I need to do my URL router provider to say otherwise, so that if it doesn't match any of the states, I'm basically saying go to the slash URL, and that corresponds to my home route. So that ends up defaulting to home. And if I want that text to show up, I need to go back here. And within this, I'm going to put in my UI view. In which case, it'll end up showing up like this. Let me give myself just a little bit of room over here by just putting in, I'm not going to do any style sheets here. I'm just going to say style, margin, bottom, 10 pixels, just so it has a little room to breathe. And let's actually go over here and let's modify our config so that the template URL is going to be home.html and tabs.html, and then we'll end up looking at nested routes and forms. Okay, once I do this, I'll start getting error messages that it can't find these things. Can't find home, not going to be able to find tabs. Let's create both of these. So in my browser, this is where I'm going to put this, my browser side code, home.html. And I'll put a div. Let's make this a class of well. And we'll say welcome to Angular Forms. So now it'll end up finding it. Again, I've got something that I could end up bookmarking. When I go to tabs, let's do the same thing. I'm going to, let's copy this into tabs.html. Welcome to the tabs. So we've got, that doesn't look right, tabs. Here's our home form. And I think let me check that. Something's a little bit off there. It's not finding that. Seems to be going back. I think I might have missed something, but let's try to figure out what it is. Ah, yes, that's exactly right. So it's not matching that URL. Okay, you know, it's kind of funny because we're saying that's a sort of a common thing where I've had situations where, like, well, it seems like I'm going to the state, but my URL isn't changing, right? So here, make sure that you put a slash here. Bobby got it, hit the nail right on the head. And this ends up now going to tabs. Now, what I want to look at here is a nested state. So let's say within our tabs, we've got two different kind of collections that we're looking at. Let's say that we're looking at places and things, or let's say people and things, right? So let's go over here and put in our tabs page. And I'm going to go in here, and within this well, I'm going to put in a UL. Let's make this class, I'm going to say nav, but I'm going to say nav pills. So it's a little bit of a different navigation. And what I'm going to do here is put a list item. I'm going to do UI sref active equals active. So again, I'm going to be using my states here, but it's going to be a nested state. And over here, I'm going to put a UI sref. And this is a nested state. This is going to be tabs people. Right, so if you didn't have any experience with nested states, you could tell it's a nested state because it's got a dot here. It's not just a state, it's tabs people. And we'll go over here and we'll make this tabs things. So if we do this, we'll see these two things. Notice nothing happens when I mouse over them because my state provider is not aware of these as being valid states. So let's make them valid states by going back in our config. And we'll do that by specifying that we have a state. And this is going to be tabs people. And so the important thing about this is that the URL, again, it's assumed that this is going to be underneath tabs. So all we have to add is the people part of this. Okay? And for our template URL, let's specify that we have people.html. And if we went over here and we moused over to people, we would see that it's going to be looking for people. And if we click on this, we'll see that it can't find people.html. So let's go in and add people.html. And let's go in here and we can actually go in. Let's assume that in our people HTML, we're going to have a UI of a class of list group. And we'll assume that we have list items, and we'll do an ng repeat. We'll say person in people. And for each person, we'll just show their name. So now we've got this people, and we won't get that error. That will get pre-selected, but notice nothing is showing up here. And this is also a very common thing. We need to go back into our tabs and specify that we have another UI view. So this is a nested UI view because this HTML template is loaded within another UI view. So now at this point, we still won't see anything. But the reason why we won't see anything is because we don't have any people. So let's actually go in and also experiment a little bit with resolve by going back to our config. And in our people, we're going to do a resolve. Resolve is just an object. For the moment, I'm just going to hard code it. Again, this has to be a function. And what we'll do is we'll return an array of 3 people. I don't like the way that looks. Hold on. So we'll do ID is 1, name is equal to Mo. We're going to do Larry. And we're going to do Curly. So we're going to return this array from the resolve method. And if we're going to return it, where does that data have to be passed to? A controller, right? We could do it right now just to get things started. We could do an inline controller. My controller has a scope. Again, probably I would have a controller. My controller probably would be called person list controller, right? Person, it's going to be displaying information about a person. List, it's where I'm doing a list of the different people. Control, probably CTRL. But just to keep it simple, now what I can do is I can pass in these people. Scope.people equals the people that were passed in. And so now I've got Mo, Larry, and Curly. And also, it looks like this should also be a class of list group item. Okay. So right now I've got people over here. And I'm also going to do one for things as well that doesn't end up existing. And by the way, notice if you try to go to a state that doesn't exist, you get an error message that says, I can't resolve this. You're trying to get me, I was on tabs, you're trying to get me to go to things, but things doesn't exist. So let's go over here. And we'll maybe even do a little copying and pasting here where we've got our tabs of people. Well, it's not really a lot that we really need to do. Let's do another state. And this is going to be tabs, things. And we'll do this a little bit in one shot here. A URL is going to be, again, it's just what goes after the tabs, which is going to be things. Let's say we're going to have a template URL, which is going to be things.html. And let's also go, again, this is more code than you should probably write in one shot, but resolve is just an object literal. We're going to resolve things, function. If this was a promise and making a call to a URL, it would wait for that to end up getting resolved. And here we're just going to we'll return two things.
Do you normally put your resolve objects in line?
Resolve objects have to be in, well, you mean the data itself?
Yeah.
No, because it's not static. Usually I'm going to be getting that data from a database, in which case my resolve would look more like this. Return $HTTP get API things. That's what it's going to look like for your homework over the weekend, because we're going to use some real data. Or even better yet, use a factory. Right, great question, great thing. It would probably be more like this. Return thing service, find all. Okay? And we could do that in a second, but let's just sort of focus on this for a little bit. So we're going to return this array. And here, Joe, that was good thought there. Both of you. You too. Jeff?
I try to think well.
Yeah, you know, that's good. You guys are thinking well. So here, let's say we have an ID of 5, and let's give this a name of rock. And this is going to be 7, and we'll give this a name of paper. We're going to resolve that. And again, if we have a controller, this will be a function, and we can get our scope. And again, we have the option to get things only because things is in the resolve block. And I'll go over here and I'll say scope.things equals things. Now when I try to go to this state, and I click on things, it's not going to find my things HTML. So we'll go over here, things.html, and we'll do a UL class list group. And we'll put an LI, and this is going to be a class of list group item. And this is going to be ng repeat. And this is going to be thing in things. And here we'll specify thing.name. Okay, now this is all well and good, right? But it kind of makes sense to me that when I click on tabs, it would be nice to default to the first tab. This is something that wasn't in the workshop and is not all that apparent to be able to do. Well, the way that we can do it is that there's nothing that prevents us from finding out the current state. And what we can do is that what will end up happening, this is actually kind of important, is that when you have a nested state, there's a controller, okay, that you can associate with the tab state, and there's another controller that you can associate with the nested states, right? We have a controller for people, we have a controller for things, but we also have one for tabs. Just to show you this, this I think is kind of important, because I think it just is such a common thing to run into. So if we end up looking at our config, and we go over here, we'll see our tabs, right? We could very easily put a controller here. And I'm going to go over here and just put a console.log just to see it's getting called. Let's do a console.log here, and let's do a console.log here too. Very important that when we do this, we'll see that hello runs. When I end up clicking on people, we'll see that world runs. Okay? Notice you didn't see hello end up running twice. Okay? It's a nested state. Angular is smart. Angular says, hey, look, I know I have a nested state here. I have a UI view here. Okay? It doesn't end up reloading what was in that tabs. I mean, just to sort of prove that to you, if I just put a input here under tabs, input class equals form control. We're going to look at some forms later. If I do that, if I go here and then here, I could put something in here. Notice that doesn't go away. That's not getting reset. Okay? And it's because the only part of the DOM that's reloading is that nested UI view. Okay? Let's take that out. We don't need that. But what I'm going to do here is that when I get into this controller, I'm going to ask the question. Because one of the things that I could find out inside this controller is the state. And I'm going to say to the state, hey, listen, state, I'm going to look at your current value. Okay, so the state object has a current value, and I'm going to look at your name. Okay, if your name is equal to tabs, meaning that I basically just clicked on that tabs link, okay, what I'm going to do is I'm going to say, hey, look, state, since I really want you to be the first nested tab, state.go, and I want you to go to tabs, people. I want that to be your default state. I mean, think about it when you were doing it for the albums. Doesn't it make sense? You know, you had that thing where you clicked on the artist. You're going to make the user click on something underneath. They're going to go crazy, right? How come you don't default to the first one? So here, now if I go here, I'm going to default to people. And notice that's nice. Tabs is still lit up for either of these.
Do that, so we switch the location of tabs and people. Whatever was the one things, the first one would be.
Tell me what you mean.
So like right now, tabs has people and things. So for what does it do?
Mm-hmm.
Can you like dynamically see which is the first thing you see now?
No, but you mean if in fact those tabs were dynamic? Maybe, you could. I mean, look, if you were generating those tabs, then you could basically just find out what the first tab was and go to that first tab. But this is not dynamic. Like, we know what the first one is, right? So in this case, it wouldn't make a lot of sense. So this is, again, a little bit of a look at nested tabs. Let's do a couple things here. Let's first of all just modify this a little bit. Let's work with our people a little bit. What we're going to do here is that instead of getting our people from here, let's actually say people service dot get, then people. And I'll show you why I'm doing this in a bit. We'll say return people. And what we're going to do here is, of course, we don't have a people service, but this is where you could inject this, and this doesn't exist yet. So here, if we ended up running this, and we were on the people tab, and I reran this, this is actually the error that disappears, right? It's never getting resolved, and you don't end up seeing anything. And again, I forget what the syntax is for fixing that, so instead of fixing it that way, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go over to my browser, and let me go and add a people service. So this is going to be Angular module app forms factory. Name of the factory is going to be people service. And the only requirement is that it ends up returning something. So let's actually just go back to our HTML, and we'll bring in this people service. And what method are we looking in for our people service? We're looking for get. Let's not do get. Let's do it. So, you know, we're used to SQLize. Let's do a find all. So here's our people service. We're going to do a find all for our people service. So let's go over here, and we're going to create some people here. Let's assume that we actually have some people, and this is going to be an array. And we'll do ID 1 is Mo, and just to make this interesting, let's say his email at example.com. We'll do these two. This is going to be Larry.
Don't they use students.com?
Say it again?
Don't they use students.com?
You know, they probably do. I always do example. It's a good question. I always do example because, you know, example is like not a real domain, so that you never have to worry about making up an email address that'll actually get sent to someone in an environment. So you wonder, like, people that don't do that, like, you know, who has Joe at smith.com or whatever. Whoever probably has that probably gets a ton of junk emails. I would guess. I don't know. Because for all these apps, they're making up these emails. So this is going to be Larry. But yeah, in the real world, of course, the Stooges have their own domain. Or, look, they're going to use Gmail. And so here, this is going to be curly. And so we'll do curly at example.com. And so we'll go over here, and we'll do a find all. This is going to be a function. And again, notice I'm sort of setting myself up for this, in fact, coming from a database. So I think what I would probably do here is just, we could bring in the Q library here, just so you see this. And with the Q library, we could create a deferred object by saying Q defer. And I could return this promise. But I could also go up here and say, I'm going to resolve it. And I'm going to resolve it with my people. And since this is sort of hidden, we'll give this an underscore. And this should end up going over here. And here's our people, but we're not seeing any people. Why not? And let's just take a look. And I think I know why, but I'll ask you this question. How come? No errors, but no errors.
Did you
Okay.
did you inject the service?
No errors. We got to that route. We just don't have any people. Come on. Yeah. Ani, you know, right? How come we're not, this data is not getting to my controller? No errors, but this data is not getting to my controller. There you go. Give that man a prize. Return. Common thing. Okay? What actually just got returned when you don't return anything? People has undefined. By the way, Angular doesn't choke on that. Angular just says, you want me to repeat something that's undefined? I just assume there's no error. I'm not going to do anything. Now when I do that, here's our people. Okay? Now, let's say that one of the things that we wanted to do was that we wanted to go and edit these people. Okay? How would we end up doing it? Well, this is kind of fun now, because what we could actually do, okay, and this is kind of a sort of a little bit more of a real-world example. What if we decided, okay, look, the way that we want to do that is that when you end up clicking on edit, we want to show a form where you can edit the information. Feels like what? Another nested route, right? If this was sort of a RESTful route, we would have /people, maybe / and we'll call it the detail, even though we're going to edit. Okay? In which case, we could do something like this. If we go over here, we can modify this, and let's put in an A, and we're going to do UI sref. So this is where I sort of left this out yesterday, and I want to make sure we cover it today, where we can actually look at putting in some parameters. Now, what's this state going to be? Well, how about tabs, people, person, where the ID is going to be, oh, I'm in the wrong thing. I apologize. We could do it with things too, but that's not what I wanted to do it with. Sorry about that. So two things we're going to look at here before we get into forms, nested routes and parameters as well. So if I go back to people, what I want to do here, a UI sref, and this is going to be tabs, people, person, parameter, ID, person, ID. And I think I'm missing something here. Okay. Now, if I go and reload this, okay, I am going to get my links here. But see, nothing happens when I mouse over it because there's no state for that. Now I'm going to create another state for it. Okay, so I'm going to go back to my config. And I'm going to go down here. And on my URL here, I'm going to create, and bear with me for a second, this is going to be a little copying and pasting so I don't have to retype this all. But here's going to be another state. Tabs, people, person. Okay? And I'm going to put a resolve in here for person. And I'm not going to find all with my person, but I'm going to use my state params, and instead of saying find all, I'm going to have a method. Let's copy what we have in Sequelize, find by ID. Request, excuse me, not request, state params dot ID, and we're going to get a person back, and we're going to return this person. Okay, this route is going to be person, but now I also want to pass an ID. Just to get it started, I'm not going to create another file. I'm just going to put a template here that shows me what the person is on my scope. And I'm going to get this person on my scope. So I'm going to catch the person on my scope. And I'm going to say scope dot person equals person. Okay? Now, if I go to run this route, this is going to bomb out, and it's going to bomb out silently. The reason why it's going to bomb out silently, it's going to recognize this route, but it's going to bomb out silently because person service does not have a find by ID, right? We're all there? Say it again?
Where you have state parameters, you also want people service?
Yes, thank you. Thank you. Ooh, on the ball. On the ball. How much sleep did you get last night? See that? Everybody needs to get 8 hours. From now on, that's mandatory. So now if I do this, I click on this, okay? I didn't lie to you, right? It silently fails. But there is an href that's being set. I know that because I see the pointer here. And if I inspect it, I'll see that it's actually got an href for tabs, people, person, 8. So now if I go back here, I'm going to modify my people service, find by ID. And again, just to make it so that eventually I'll connect this up to a database, right? I'm going to say person equals, and this is going to be people, and this is going to be filter function person, and I'll return where the person's ID. I'm just going to do the double equal sign because that parameter comes in as a string, equals the ID that was passed in. So this is going to be ID, and filter gives me one item. Again, if I was using something like Lodash, someone had a question about Lodash, about using the underscore. Lee, was that you?
Yeah.
So yeah, Lodash, pretty common that you could use it. You could use it in Angular as well. But this is going to get my person. And again, just so this is a promise, which it would be in the real world, we'll say DFD equals, this is another promise pattern. This queue comes with Angular. You could use Bluebird if you wanted to by bringing it in. We'll say DFD resolve person, but we're going to return our promise. Because that's, in the end, we're going to do something probably with a GET request. DFT promise. And I don't think we'll see anything, but we should be going to these things. How come we don't see anything? Anyone want to take a stab? That's right. Now we've got our third UI view, this time inside of people. And let's give this, let's just put this in a class of well.
Question for you. I've seen the UI view on an actual div, and I've seen it as tag itself. Is that the way to do it?
I usually do it on its own tag. I don't think it really matters. So now if I do this, here I could see Mo, here I could see Larry, here I could see Curly. Okay? I'll show you a trick to show you how to select something in a little bit, but before we do that, let's start talking about how we're going to end up doing some forms so we can edit these guys. Let's go in here, and what we're going to do is we're going to, instead of sending back this and putting all this in here, which we don't really have this much, let's do a template URL. And our URL is going to be person.html. Of course, if we go and refresh this, we'll end up getting an error that it can't find that person.html. But let's go in here, and we'll end up adding this person.html. And let's go in here and we're going to actually go here. And here, if I just do person, I'll be at the same spot that I was before. And here's my person. Okay? Well, let's do a form here, and we're going to start talking about forms, and we're going to start talking about validation. So here I'm going to put in a form, and I'm going to put in a div with a class of form group. And I'm going to go over here, and I'll put an input. This class is going to be form control. And my ng model is going to be person.name. Okay. So we go in here and we click on Mo, and look what happens on the top. We really want to do things maybe a little bit differently here, where we want to put a button, class equals btn, btn primary, save. So we want to be able to save this, but it sort of makes sense that we don't want to start changing Mo right off the bat, right? Makes sense to me that I don't want this to change up here. I mean, it's kind of cool that it does. It tells us that, Angular is sort of tracking these things as objects. But this is a pretty common thing that you'll often want to avoid. And one way to avoid it is to use something that we actually looked at before, which is that when we go in this config, instead of actually returning the person themselves, okay, what we could do is make an Angular copy of this person. Okay? So what it does is it goes to that person and it creates a new object. So the object that's up there on the top is different than the object on the bottom. Okay? We'll sync them up eventually. When the user says, I'm ready to sync them up, we'll sync them up. So now if we go back here, and I do this, notice it doesn't change on the bottom. Pretty cool, right? Okay. When we want to sync them up, we'll end up doing a save. So let's set that up. Where in our controller, let's have a scope.save. And when we end up doing a scope.save, I assume that when we want to save something, who's going to be responsible for saving? The person service, right? So for the person service, we'll go over here and we'll say person service dot save scope dot person. And when we go up to our person here, let's do an ng click. And let's call it, we'll call it save. So we're going to go up here to our config. We're going to call save with scope.person. This should end up unknown provider, person service, people service. Should have called it person service, but I called it people. I usually like to do singulars for my services. Same way that I do on the server side. So this is going to throw an error because person service is not defined. That's not what I was looking for. I was looking for people service save. Now when I click on that, it says people service save is not a function. Let's write this out. So on our service, which is over here, we're going to do a save. We're passing in a person. So this is kind of cool. One of the things we could do is something like existing, right? The person that we want to find is this, find by ID, person ID. Then we'll have again, we're doing this with promises, which is a more realistic way to do it eventually. So here we're going to end up getting back, I'll call this existing. And what we could end up doing here is now we've said, hey, look, we're good. Angular, copy, person, into existing. Okay? Again, if we were actually doing this on the server, we'd end up making a change on the server. But what this should do is, if I do that, it ends up saving Mo. Okay? And in fact, once we're done with that, we always want to, if things are asynchronous, even though we're not really have a lot going on here that's asynchronous, we want to do a return. And let's just go back to our config. And after we tell this guy to save, we're going to say Angular copy. That's our resolve. And then when we say save, we'll say then. And when we save, let's just say state.go tabs people. Right? You're done editing. We're going to take you back. By the way, a lot of times this is happening because my server is restarting. So I should probably just, so you see it one more time, the more that you see it, the more that you'll use it. With nodemon, ignore, and this has to be a string. We're going to ignore anything in the browser. I'm going to kill this, restart this. Go up to here again. Here's people. Right, so we go tabs, we go people, we say Mo. That gets updated. State's not defined, okay. So let's go back to our config. And if we want to say state.go, order doesn't matter here. Doesn't make a difference. Everything that it needs will end up getting injected. So now if we say Mo, cannot resolve tabs people. It's not tabs people, it's the name of the state, tabs.people. Reload this, Mo, and we're back here, right? Gives us a little bit of an editing interface here. How about a cancel button? Cancel button is pretty easy. Go to person, same button. This time we'll say cancel. This will be button default. What I know about UX, I could put on the back of a postage stamp, but I know there's probably some order between these things. Some of you know more about it than I do, I'm sure. But when I go to cancel, here, I'm basically just going to change my state. State. Go back here. So now I go to edit Mo, I decide to cancel. I go to edit Larry, I decide to do that, I cancel, and I'm back here. Okay? Now, let's assume that we really need to have a name for Mo. Okay? We don't want to have this scenario happen. It's just not cool because there's nothing to click on. We want to avoid that scenario. So one of the things we can do here, if we wanted to, we could go over here and say ng disabled. When are we going to disable? Hey, look, when not person dot name. When you don't have a person's name, we're going to disable this. Click on Mo. Now we can't save it. It's good. It's a starting point. Let's also do a couple of other things here. I'm going to put another input here. And this is going to be for person.email. So now we have person.email. Let's actually just put a placeholder here. And this is going to be placeholder name. And now we've got mo@example.com, but let's say that we wanted to make sure you couldn't save it with an empty email either. Okay? We could go back here or not person.email. That's going to get pretty messy, right? Let's say you had a form with 10 different fields. Well, one of the things that you get with Angular is that you could actually do a couple of interesting things here. One of the things you could do is that the form itself, believe it or not, is actually, Angular is actually treating this as a directive, even though you haven't seen the directives yet. There's actually a controller under the covers that gets created. I'm going to show you something kind of cool here. I'm going to give this form a name of form, okay? And I'm going to give this, field a form of name as well, okay? Let me show you something that's kind of cool here. What will automatically happen on the scope is that the scope will actually have a property for form.name, okay? The scope will actually have a property for form.name. Again, form is the name of the form. This field is named name. And if I do form.name, watch what happens. I get all this data. I have a view value. I've got some validators. I've got a, look, I'll show you one that's kind of cool. See where it says pristine is true? Pristine just changed to false. It's not pristine. What does pristine mean? Pristine means no one ever typed anything in there. Okay? So now what I have here is Angular has a lot of support for forms. So I'm going to do a couple of very, very quick things here. One of the things that gives me the ability to do is actually to specify that this is required. And instead of just saying form.name, I'm going to say form.name valid. These are all things that are built in with Angular. See, right now I'm valid. Now I'm not valid. Okay? One of the beauties of this is I could do the same thing here with email. Name is email. Okay? And now what I could say, hey, look, I want you to be disabled. This is actually a terrific thing. And I could specify, remember I told you that there was something on the scope for form? Once you put that name there, automatically gets created. I could say, when not form, valid. Okay? When the form is not valid, disable this button. And let's make sure that I specify that my email is also required too. So now, if I go over here and I get rid of the email, this becomes invalid. If I get rid of the name, this becomes invalid. Okay? One other thing that I want to do here, by the way, I could be a little bit more descriptive here. I could also specify, actually, not even valid. Let me be more descriptive if it's invalid. I want this to be disabled if this is invalid. If you look at the documentation for Angular Forms, this is now invalid, and I could make this invalid as well.
And the only thing making that invalid is that it's got no characters.
That I specified it was required. You want to see something cooler? I mean, as if. As if. We're going to put a type here. It's actually something browsers support now, but Angular does a little more work here. I'm going to say type is email. Now if I go back here, and I get rid of this, it's no longer valid. Now I'm valid again. Okay? Now, one more thing I want you to do, because the same way that people get confused over nested views, and hopefully I clarified a couple of things here, people get confused over doing other types of forms. Let's say, just theoretically, that there's 3 different roles that you could have. Okay? And I'm going to hard code this, but we could sort of pretend that it's not hard coded. Let's pretend that we have 3 different roles, and what we'll do here, let's go back to our people service, and we're going to give Mo a role ID of 1. We'll give Curly a role ID of 2, and we'll give Larry. Actually, let's say department. Right? We've done this before. We'll say department ID. And what we're going to do here, so this is stuff that's on the view. If I went back to my person.html, I could put in another class of form group. And I could put in person department ID. And I'll see that this will show up for Mo and Larry and Curly. Let's get rid of this thing that we have up here. And let's actually go back to our config. And the same place we're returning the person, I'm going to end up returning 3 roles. So let's 3 departments. Let's pretend that we're getting our departments from a database. Let's pretend we're going to resolve these. We're not really going to resolve them. We're just going to hard code it at the moment. And I'm going to return 3 departments. So let's say that department 1 has an ID, and we'll give it a name of engineering. Thank you. And here we have engineering. Let's think of another department, HR. We need a 2 there. And we'll do a 5, 6, let's say. Name executive. Okay, so we've got these 3 departments, which we can end up catching over here. Departments, right? This should still load. This is going to get resolved. And what I'm going to do here, I want to be able to choose the department. And so what we're going to do here is let's put this departments on the scope. And what we're going to do on this view, and this is a little bit tricky, what we're going to do is we're going to put in a select object, give it a class of form control. And there's a directive in Angular, something called ng options. And let me tell you something. I am constantly screwing this up, but I'm going to take a shot at it here. What I'm going to say is, so the way that this ends up reading is department.name, okay? Meaning this is what's going to be shown as an option, okay? But the value that I'm really concerned with, the value that I'm storing, department.name as department ID. Let me check my syntax here. Sorry. And I actually have it incorrect. So I'm concerned with the department ID, but what I want to show is department name as department name. I want to show it as the department name for department in departments. Okay? Now, what's going to happen here when I run this is that I'm going to get an error. And the error I'm going to get is that, hey, look, you know what? You can't just give me these options and not specify what model you're talking about for the user. And what this is really saying is that the department ID is the one that's going to correspond to the model that I put here. This is going to be the department ID for my person. So what I have to do here is specify a model. And my model is going to be, ng model is going to be person dot department ID. So now, when I do that, notice that Mo defaults to engineering, Larry defaults to HR, Curly is HR. If I want to switch this out, and I want to say Mo is going to be an executive, I can do that. Where's my button? Usually I'm missing, probably need, I think you're right. I think you are 100% correct. And so now if I wanted to switch Mo to executive, I could do that. Let's see if it got sort of fake persisted, where now he's an executive. This, I'm doing Angular for a long time. I always have to look that one up. Let's sort of think about if we could do it as a mnemonic, right? Not a mnemonic. Let's just think about this for a second. It would be better if we could sort of memorize this, right? We'll think about this as sort of the alias that shows up as, okay? This is going to correspond to whatever the model property is. Our model is going to be the department ID. And this is for these two items. So whatever we have here on the scope for departments is going to have both a name and an ID, which it does. Okay? That's what I wanted to wrap up on forms. I want to pop up this keynote presentation real fast, which I think will make a lot of sense. Okay, so we've basically got this form directive where we could give our form a name, and it basically is creating this controller under the covers, right? And it I'm sorry, guys, I did this way too early. I knew this was not good. Okay, so here basically what we're going to want to talk about is form validation. Again, we cover a lot of stuff under the form validation. I wanted to see the states again. Basically, this is if someone tells me they love writing validation code, they're totally lying. No one likes to do it. Here's just sort of the progression of how this stuff works. If you had this kind of form, which is not that much different than our form, you might have this situation where you're going to submit the form, and you're going to want to do some checking, and you check whether you have these values, and then you decide, look, I got to do some more checking, and I want to do some more checking, and I want to do some more checking, and eventually you start losing your mind. Okay, and basically no one wants to end up doing this, so there's some framework that they end up using. Angular has some stuff built in, right? It's going to be this flexible pattern for handling input. It's going to be declarative by declaring something as an email, by declaring something as required. We could compose these things together, and it allows us to build these things up. And you've seen this already. This is not new to you, the idea of using an ng model. So the ng model is this two-way data binding that we could end up using, right? We could end up basically, we could pass a value. If the value is not there, it'll actually set the value up on the scope. So here, we could do an ng model for credit card number, but more than likely, we're going to have this object, card.number, card.type. And what ends up happening is when you do this, you'll have this built-in controller that you could end up using. So there's all kinds of things. Some of these we ended up looking at. If you had some pattern that you wanted to match, you could do it with an ng pattern. You could do an ng max length, where the value has to be longer or shorter. You can do ng required, but by the way, required does the exact same thing as ng required. If you wanted to have a URL, you could give a type of a URL. So what you end up having, what you can end up leveraging with this is this form controller, where, in our case, we just called ours form. And then what you could do is you could end up composing these elements. So we've seen this, right? It allows you to basically, instead of saying, hey, look, I'm going to disable this, if all these things are true, it allows you to put something directly on the button itself. So you have the ability of giving these things names, and didn't sort of follow through here, but you could end up giving these things names, and if you end up giving these things names, you have the ability of saying, hey, look, I'm going to disable this thing if, in fact, my payment form is invalid. One other thing, I want to show you one other thing real quick. So this is kind of a neat thing, too. If you wanted to give the user some visual indication of why their form is not being submitted, so here they might not know, well, I mean, obviously they would know something here that this would be a problem. One of the things with Bootstrap is Bootstrap has a class that you could put on. If on this form group, I put in has error, this is Bootstrap, this will show up as being read, and it doesn't like something here. It's kind of funny that it looks at this, doesn't like something. I don't know why. Okay? One of the things that you could do here is that you don't want to show that all the time, but what you could end up doing here is you could use our ng class. So ng class basically allows you to do put on classes based on conditions. And what I could say here is has error. And when do we want to show has error? We want to show has error when form.name is invalid. Okay? So here, I don't know what this parse error is doing. Something is missing here. Let's see if this is still working. It doesn't look like it's working. So this should.
What is not learned?
Where am I? What do you think I'm missing the quote? Yes, you know what? You're right. Whew. Oh, nice call. Okay, so that'll make that error go away. So here, this is always going to be red. I don't want it red all the time. I only want it to be red when form.name invalid. So that's that whole composition of that I get from naming these forms and these controllers. And now I could do that. And on the same token, I could do the same thing here. Yank. And this is not going to be name. This is going to be email. I'm telling you, if you had to write this, you would pull your hair out. Okay? Nice UI that you could end up giving to the user. And sometimes you have different validations, like not a valid email. You could decide to do that. One of the things that you could actually do here, this is the last thing, and then I'm going to kill this lecture. Just want to show you that if I say form.email, if we end up looking at this, I'll show you something kind of cool here. If I see form.email, I actually see I should end up seeing an error property. And if you look at that error property, it says email is true. Watch this. If I kill this, it says required is true. So the point that I'm trying to make is that you could also sniff around. There's actually an error property, which now it's empty. Now it's email is true. Now it's required is true. Allows you to customize your message by looking at that property to say, hey, look, you have to put in something. And by the way, you have to put in an email. Just sort of throwing that out. I could always cancel, and I'm back in business. Okay. Let me kill this.